This podcast was created in response to the carceral and exclusionary elements of LAUSD's special education policy. It critiques the existing framework using lived experiences, academic literature like the Pedagogy of Pathologization, written by Subini Anama. Inspired by activist community voices, my podcast aims to imagine an abolitionist response rooted in care and inclusivity. I'm hoping that this podcast will not only reach educators, parents, policymakers, and youth, especially those with lived experience navigating special education, but I also want to specifically address LAUSD's Division of Special Education Board, including its Community Advisory Committee and Local Plan Revision Committee. I want to raise awareness about some of their harmful practices and areas that can be improved within their special education policies. This project builds upon critiques by writers like Carl Pearson and Christina Samuels, which while proposing a framework modeled after successful inclusive programs like the Chime Institute. To be able to do this podcast is honestly very empowering for me, not only as a student who grew up in LAUSD's school district, but also as a young woman of color who was diagnosed late with a learning disability at the age of 17 and had to kind of navigate my own experiences. So, with that, let's dive into LAUSD's special education policies and analyze areas that we see carceral logics reflected within those policies and practices that they implement. So, LAUSD special education policy states all individuals with disabilities with exceptional needs have a right to participate in free, appropriate public education, and that special education, instruction, and services for these persons are needed to ensure them of the right to an appropriate educational opportunity to meet their unique needs. This was 2007 LAUSD special education policy. It promised that every child, regardless of ability, would receive a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. But when we look at how this plays out in the Los Angeles Unified School District, the reality is kind of far from that vision. Unfortunately, LAUSD's actual practices for special education often fall short and perpetuate harmful systems. So, specifically, the central critique is that LAUSD's special education policies and implementation reflect carceral logics, applying mechanisms typically associated with that we see of prisons. So, they use logics such as extraction, surveillance, and captivity. We see this in how they extract students who may have a learning disability or a physical disability, as well as surveilling them. They have certain policies rooted in place, like the child search and serve, which we would talk about that, and captivity. So taking them and placing them in either a separate environment from their peers, which often the circumstances within that aren't serving them in the way they need to. So I want to talk about the demographics of LAUSD. I'm specifically going to talk about the students who have IEP plans. And it says there's about 78% students of color. This is information given by LAUSD Special Education. It was their 2022-2023 statistics. There's about 78% of students of color with perceived disabilities that have IEP plans. The practices I really want to focus on that are within LAUSD's special education policies are the eligibility and assessment, so child find and search and serve, parental rights and procedural safeguards, the least restrictive environment, individualized educational programs or IEPs, and discipline and behavior. These were the main elements of the policy that I felt reflected carceral logics within them. So these are going to be the main topics of discussion. And also how I built my abolitionist response was in responses to these four various policy overviews. So the child finds and search and serve policy refers to the process of locating, identifying, and evaluating children who may be eligible for special education services from birth to age 21 living within LAUSD's school district. So this evaluation often examines youth who are experiencing homelessness, student migrants, wards of the state, and children and youth attending private schools located within the district's boundaries. This is also based off of LAUSD's 2010 child fine policy. And then the parents' rights and procedural safeguards, this refers to the fact that parents are expected to attend every IEP meeting and have the right to consent or refuse evaluations and services, including disciplinary actions on behalf of the student. The least restrictive environment practice calls for the integration of non-disabled presenting students with children with disabilities to the maximum extent possible. So this is basically just mixing students with no perceived disabilities with children who do have a perceived disability. So if a student is removed from the classroom, the IEP team needs to justify this removal and determine an appropriate educational plan. Lastly, another practice that LAUSD engages in is this concept called manifestation determination. So manifestation determination is one of the approaches used to determine disciplinary actions for special education students. It's essentially when the IEP team determines if an inappropriate behavior, quote unquote inappropriate, is a manifestation of the child's disability and therefore decides on the best practice for disciplining them. So if a student with disabilities has behavioral issues, parents or school staff can request an assessment to determine the function of the behavior and develop support strategies. Okay. So if the IEP team finds behavior isn't related to disability, the school can then discipline the student with the disability the same way they would discipline a student without it. The IEP services, so the Individualized Education Program, may include measuring and analyzing the student's performance to determine the unique resources that they may need. This includes like resource specialist programs, special day classes, designated instruction and services, and speech and therapy counseling. Now, I want to highlight the shortcomings in these current practices that not only impede student success and growth, but they often reflect a carceral mindset. They use those same logics they were talking about, extraction, surveillance, and confinement, to disproportionately impact students with developmental disabilities. And in LAUSD's case, that is a very marginalized group that has even more intersectionality because it is primarily students of color. So these systems not only frequently continue to punish and exclude these students, but they also contribute to this school to prison nexus. This discretion and ambiguity in disciplinary actions can often result in inconsistent measures and potential discriminatory practices. So I want to talk about LAUSD has it in their policy practice that school authorities are allowed to use physical force and restraints on their students with disabilities based on feelings of unsafety. And when I saw this, I immediately thought how it's similar to law enforcement's deadly force rule that essentially allows law enforcement and correctional officers to use deadly force based on this perceived threat. And it's completely up to the officer's discretion to decide if they should shoot to kill. So now we see how this policy specifically is directly aligned with carceral logics. You're overriding students' rights and you're dehumanizing them based on this manifestation determination of your own feeling of unsafety. And also, on the other side of using the manifestation determination, if you're already allowing a, a school authority to discipline their students in that way without any counseling, without any conversation happening prior, then what use is that policy? So not only is this going to lead to significant discretion in behavioral interventions, this is also going to lead to inconsistency and discriminatory application that's particularly going to affect students of color within LAUSD. And not only is this because of it's majority student of colors with IEP plans, but it's also because they're already targets for discriminatory practices. So now LAUSD, you're prioritizing this environment of control and compliance rather than care and empowerment for your students. Now I want to talk about the principle of the least restrictive environment. This policy, although aimed at calling for the integration of students, it still allows for that discretionary practice that allows schools to retain this significant discretion to place students in separate classrooms, which can also limit interaction with non-disabled peers and reinforce exclusionary practices and stigma. Some schools, even within the LAUSD school district, explicitly state, this actually was the case of my middle school, they explicitly state limitations on available services and base admission and enrollment decisions on resources rather than accommodating needs. So existing research has cited that critiques the segregated nature of special education and its failure to provide equitable opportunities. Sabini Anama's article, Pedagogy of Pathologization, actually articulates this. She talks about how students in specialized classrooms often do not receive a quality education that actually prepares them for future opportunities, which further marginalizes this already disadvantaged group and hinders their success beyond schooling. Other accounts have also attested to this. So Carl J. Peterson, who is a father of a child with a developmental disability, has noted that the same thing happened for his child, where there's this idea of this one-size-fits-all approach to special education, which does not account for students' individual needs and often reinforces cycle of academic failure and exclusion. Dina A. Samuels, author of Education Week's article, Special Education is Broken, also reported that there is a large study in 2015 that showed that students in the program who were supposedly receiving targeted interventions for special education performed worse than virtually identical peers who were not in a response to intervention, so the RTI process. Not only is this further marginalizing these students, but it's also now putting them in proximity to incarceration. Thirdly, I want to talk about another one of the procedures that LAUSD uses that kind of reflect another idea of carceral logics, especially the idea of surveillance as well as exclusion. So, for one, the child find and search and serve, although meant to identify and support students, and often results in intrusive surveillance and labeling. As LAUSD monitors youth considered at risk, quote unquote, like I stated before, LAUSD specifically says that those that they target as at risk are those experiencing homelessness, migrants, and wards of the state. These are all students that they are looking for that they believe need to be evaluated for a disability. So now the most marginalized groups are being continuously observed, continuously evaluated, and documented. They're being hyper surveilled essentially. And now these monitoring systems kind of frame socially constructed behaviors as normal or abnormal, and now they justify control over students with disabilities based on those perceived systems that they evaluated. So this kind of mirrors the idea that children who are at risk of behaving in a way that does not actually support the model fit to enact social control over marginalized groups. So LAUSD is essentially saying we have to extract them, we have to place them somewhere else to further monitor their behavior and control anything that could be quote unquote detrimental to the entirety or the evaluation of the institution. And I say this because this is a common concept we keep seeing. We see this especially with student protests and how schools value their reputation, sometimes even more than they value their students. We see this a lot in these universities, but this is also something that could be applied to these younger level educational institutions, especially when it comes to children with disabilities, because now we have to look at standardized testing, we have to look at school evaluations, how schools measure themselves against other schools, how schools measure teachers against other teachers. Just all these evaluation steps that now may be affected because of the institution's inability to serve students with developmental disabilities or with adverse life experiences. Not only are students being heavily and overly surveilled by this LAUSD child find, search, and serve policy, but so are their parents, especially the parents of color. Anna Ma talks about this in her article. She says that there's a strand of nexus that relies on the pedagogy of pathologization as it utilizes hypersurveillance, monitoring parents of color for a variety of reasons, many of which do not apply to white parents. So hyperlabeling, determining that parents of color are unfit or neglectful, and hyper punishment. So this removes their children of color from their home for varied periods of time. So once parents and families become part of this nexus, as Anna states, like now it's even more difficult to be free of this pedagogy of pathologization or these carceral logics that are being reinforced within it. And although LAUSD allows parents to, or at least or expects parents to be attending every IEP meeting and putting their input into different IEP evaluations, it does the policy doesn't provide any agencies towards students. It doesn't ask them for their input. It actually labels their input as an option. So students aren't even involved in the procedures that are happening to them, the disciplinary actions that are happening to them, how they're being taught. There are also multiple ethical considerations to be established within this. Like, how are you going to expect parents with children under some of these socioeconomic conditions to be available or understand that child's needs in the same way that the child might understand their own needs, especially if they're battling other extenuating circumstances. Even more so, many parents may not fully grasp what exactly an IEP entails due to cultural and economic differences in their understanding of disability, particularly cognitive disabilities. This concept, which is relatively recent and more frequently discussed in higher socioeconomic circles, specifically in wealthier white families who have access to medical specialists who can provide the accurate medical diagnoses as well as the proper accommodations. Last segment, I want to talk about my personal abolitionist approaches that kind of use frameworks that have already been established in other school institutions, as well as through other activist groups that are looking to make sure that there is equitable processing in education. So these are all frameworks that I've applied to some of these approaches. Part of my proposal is also to reallocate funding from LAUSD's security funds, which has a budget of 69.2 million. I believe that a lot of this funding can go into having an increased number of educators available, as well as trauma-informed training models that train educators extensively on inclusive education and trauma-informed teaching and pedagogies. One proposal that I offer is this 5-to-1 ratio. So the 5-to-1 ratio underscores the need for more trauma-informed educators for every 5 students in the class. So one of the main concerns with the least restrictive environments policy is if we do integrate students with non-disabilities and students with disabilities, how are we going to ensure that every student is getting their needs met? And this is where I propose the 5-to-1 ratio module. So imagine every 5 students in the classroom had access to one or at least one trauma-informed educator trained in inclusive pedagogy. Smaller group learning does build trust, as we've seen in several research practices. It increases safety and allows students to ask for help without fear of judgment. As Anima notes from one of her researchees, many of these students felt uncomfortable asking for support in front of the entire class. I can also attest for this based on my own experiences. This was in high school specifically when I was before I was diagnosed actually with my learning disability. If I asked for help, I would receive looks from my peers, and so that really discouraged me from asking my teachers for extra help. And it wasn't until I kept scoring poorly on my exams that I finally found time outside of class to go and get help from the teacher like every lunch period. Um, but not only was that taking me away from just having a rest time during my lunch, I was now also taking the teacher away. So not only would the 5-to-1 ratio just allow students that extra privacy when asking for help, to not feel like they're disturbing the lesson or, acting as a burden. It also just allows them the same amount of time and opportunities for relationship building outside the class. So, this ratio disrupts the current least restrictive environment practice, which often encourages educators to pathologize differences rather than actually understand them. Educators can begin to understand their structural traumas their students face and respond with empathy and creativity. Collaboration should and must extend beyond traditional hierarchies. Peer to peer support, parent student teacher coalitions, and reflective joint meetings need to become the norm. So these structures will challenge isolation and instead focus on students' strengths rather than their weaknesses. Special education policies that ignore student voices replicate the oppressive systems abolition seeks to dismantle. This is why my second proposal is focused on prioritizing student agency and centering youth in their own education. When LAUSD excludes students from decisions about their curriculum, accommodations, and disciplinary outcomes, it robs them of agency and reinforces a hierarchical, compliance based model of schooling. Instead, student agency must be embedded at every level. From designing lesson plans to co creating behavior supports, this shift moves us away from managing behavior and toward honoring student autonomy and insight. My second to last proposal is focused on how we can implement restorative justice practices. The use of restraint, seclusion, and exclusionary discipline is not only ineffective, it is violent. These are the practices that the LAUSD's disciplinary policies are perpetuating within their framework. These methods idealize carceral logics that criminalize disability and reproduce trauma. Restorative justice practices rooted in dialogue, relationship building, and repair offer a radical alternative. Researchers Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey also discuss this idea of peer empowerment through restorative circles, saying that these circles can boost relationships and learning, and also you can use circles to solve problems. Carl J. Pearson also discusses this idea where he talks about how a peer buddy system allows general ed students to build relationships with special needs classmates. He further argues that it's not about separation, it's about community. So, restorative justice models can replace these exclusionary disciplines with healing conversations. Not only do they keep kids in schools, it also helps them grow and foster true inclusion. My fourth abolition proposal actually follows the framework of the Chime Institute, which is an LAUSD charter school. So, the Chime Institute employs a transdisciplinary approach where all staff work with both children with and without disabilities to avoid stigmatizing or isolating students. They also provide many opportunities for children to participate in coordinated activities in which teachers, therapists, and the family of students develop activities that focus on various skills to be taught simultaneously within the classroom. This further emphasizes the desire to challenge and motivate each child's unique abilities and interests in a natural learning process. So, through this framework, I would like to employ that onto how I believe curriculums need to have culturally responsive and interdisciplinary lessons that promote both learning and belonging. Anima states this actually in her article, where she discusses how when schools become a site for criminalization, students become suspicious of their authority figures who pathologize them in their pedagogy. This does not mean that all teachers are purposely targeting these multiply marginalized disabled girls, but instead, teachers are often encouraged or even required to monitor and report on their students in public schools and even at times contact probation officers or police officers. This is why implementing diverse curriculum pedagogies need to be sufficiently placed in every educational institution. Schools should implement coordinated activities that address a variety of skills at the same time, similar to the Chime Institute model, rather than isolating individual skills. The curriculum should emphasize socio emotional learning, such as incorporating arts and movement based learning. Culture responsive teaching is the gateway to encouraging natural and diverse learning practices without excluding anybody and ensuring that everybody gets a fair chance to learn on an equal level. To the LAUSD Special Education Division, Community Advisory Committee, and Local Plan Revision Committee, I hope this analysis urges you to act. I urge you to audit and reduce the use of restraint and isolation on students, eliminate discriminatory assessment practices, require student participation in IEPs, and shift funding toward inclusive, trauma informed teaching models. This is more than policy reform, it's a cultural shift, one that centers care over control and inclusion over isolation.